On the morning of November 16, 1796, the most powerful woman on the planet wakes up in a good mood. She tells her maid she slept better than she has in months. She drinks her coffee. She signs papers. She's 67 years old. She rules 1/6 of the land surface of the earth. And she has ruled it for 34 years without a husband, without a regent, and without anyone's permission. A few hours later, her servants find her on the floor of her dressing room. Her face is the wrong color. Her breathing has gone ragged. She never speaks again. That is how Catherine II of Russia died. A stroke. A woman in her 60s, alone on a floor. The way tens of thousands of people die every single day. And within a generation, Europe had replaced that death with a horse. Think about what that actually takes. Not a misunderstanding. Not a rumor that drifted. A deliberate, sustained, cross-border editing project in which the woman who annexed the Crimea rewrote Russian law and put a needle in her own arm to prove a vaccine was safe, was overwritten by a barnyard punchline that any coroner could have disproved in an afternoon. Here's what I keep coming back to. That horse story isn't just an insult. It's a lock on a door, because as long as you're laughing at it, you never ask the real question, which is this. How did a broke German teenager with no army, no money, no claim, and no legal right to anything at all end up on the Russian throne? And how many times did she come within inches of never getting there? Because she almost didn't, over and over again. And so did everyone standing near her. She was not born Catherine. She was not born Russian. She was not, by any standard the 18th century cared about, born important on May 2nd, 1729, in the Baltic port of Stettin, Prussian then, Polish now. A girl named Sophie Friedrich Augusta von Holzherbst arrived into one of the smallest, poorest, most forgettable princely houses in the German lands. Her father, Christian August, was a professional soldier in Prussian service and a genuinely decent man who mostly wanted to be left alone. Her mother, Johanna Elizabeth, was something else entirely: ambitious, restless, indiscreet, and, this matters, openly disappointed that her firstborn was a girl. Sophie grew up knowing she was the consolation prize, and I think that's the single most underrated fact of her entire life. Every biography wants to start with the coup. I'd start here, with a bright child in a drafty house learning very early that affection is not given, it is earned, and that if nobody is going to hand you a place in the world, you had better become useful enough that someone offers you one. The offer came in 1744. It came from Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who needed a bride for her nephew and heir, Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp, the future Peter III. Elizabeth wanted a girl from a family too small to be a threat, and too poor to bring foreign politics with her. Sophie's family was perfect precisely because it was insignificant. Frederick II of Prussia liked the idea too. A German girl in the Russian imperial bed was, to him, a cheap piece of chess. So a 14-year-old and her mother crossed the frozen continent in a sledge, in January, toward a country neither of them had ever seen. And here is the first door, and it nearly slammed on her before she got through it. Her mother could not keep her mouth shut. Johanna arrived in Russia and immediately began doing informal errands for Frederick of Prussia, passing along impressions, cultivating the wrong people, playing at diplomacy in a court where amateur diplomacy got you deported. Elizabeth found out. Johanna was disgraced, sidelined, and eventually sent home, and she very nearly took her daughter with her. What saved Sophie was, of all things, nearly dying. That winter she came down with a savage pleurisy. She burned with fever 4 weeks. She was bled, by some accounts more than a dozen times, which in 1744 was less a treatment than a coin flip. And at the moment when everyone assumed the German girl was finished, someone suggested bringing her a Lutheran pastor. Sophie, 15 years old, half dead, barely able to sit up, said no. Send me the Orthodox priest instead. Send me Simon Todorsky. Read that again, a teenager, delirious with fever, in a foreign country, calculating, the whole Russian court heard about it within a day. That girl, they said. That German girl asked for our priest. Elizabeth wept. Whatever her mother had wrecked, the daughter had just repaired, from a sick bed, in a language she barely spoke. On June 28, 1744, she was received into the Orthodox faith and took the name Yekaterina Alexeyevna. Catherine. She would keep the accent her whole life. She would never lose it, but she learned the language obsessively. And there's a story she told on herself later, pacing her bedroom at night, barefoot on cold floors, drilling Russian pronunciation, until she was chilled to the bone. That barefoot habit may well be what triggered the pleurisy that nearly killed her. So, the door, if Johanna's spying had surfaced 6 weeks earlier, if the fever had gone 1 degree hotter, if a 15-year-old had asked for the pastor she'd been raised with instead of the priest of a country she'd known for 4 months. There is no Catherine the Great. There's a minor German princess who marries a minor German count and dies unrecorded. She survived, and then she was handed to Peter. They were married on August 21st, 1745. She was 16. He was 17. They were also second cousins, which nobody in that room found remarkable. Popular history has flattened Peter into a cartoon, the idiot who played with toy soldiers. And look, the toy soldiers are real. So is the drinking, which started young. So is the story of him court-martialing a rat that had chewed one of his starch figures and hanging it. So is his obsession with drilling servants in Holstein uniforms in the middle of the night. But I want to be fair to him for a minute, because the cartoon does a disservice to how bad this actually was. Peter was a child of catastrophic loss. Mother dead in infancy, father dead at 11, dragged out of his home duchy to a country that despised him, converted out of his religion, told daily that the only thing he was for was producing an heir. He was, by most accounts, a person of limited gifts placed under limitless pressure. Some historians have suggested a developmental disorder. We can't diagnose across 2.5 centuries, and I won't pretend to. What we can say is this: he was miserable, and he made her miserable, and the two of them were locked in a gilded room together for 18 years, while everyone in Europe watched and waited for a baby. So what did she do with 18 years? She read. That's the answer, and it's the whole answer. She read Voltaire until she could argue with him, and eventually she did, by mail, for 15 years. She read Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, which she later called her prayer book, and she read Tacitus, and she said something about it that I think is the key to the entire woman. Tacitus, she wrote, caused a revolution in my head, not a change of opinion, a revolution, because what Tacitus teaches, if you read him young and lonely and powerless, is that public virtue and private motive are almost never the same thing, that history is written by whoever survives, and that power is a machine with visible levers. A bored teenage girl in a hostile court read the greatest cynic of the ancient world and learned how the machine works, -1 years before she ever touched it. Meanwhile, the door in this chapter is a very simple one, and it stayed cracked open for almost 2 decades. Russia had a standard procedure for inconvenient wives. You shave their heads and put them in a convent. Peter the Great did it to his first wife. It was not exotic. It was administrative. Catherine was inconvenient for 18 years. She was foreign. She was childless for 9 of them. She was smarter than her husband and made no real secret of it. And she took lovers, Sergei Saltykov first, in the early 50s, then Stanisław Poniatowski, then Gregory Orlov. Any one of those was a legal pretext to put her in a cell for life. Why didn't it happen? Because in 1754 she finally produced a son. And the moment she did, Empress Elizabeth took the baby out of the room and raised him herself. And Catherine, who had nearly died in childbirth, was left on a sweat-soaked mattress in a drafty room. And by her own account, nobody came to check on her 4 hours. That's the marriage. Hold on to that image, because it explains almost everything that comes later. She had 18 years to think about what she would do if the door ever opened. 3 children, and the paternity of all 3 is a question mark that has never been closed. Paul, born September 20th, 1754, In her own memoirs, Catherine strongly implies the father was Sergei Saltykov. Some historians take her at her word. Others, Simon Dixon among them, point out that Catherine wrote those memoirs decades later with an agenda, and that Paul grew up to look and behave uncannily like Peter, right down to the parade ground obsession. It's genuinely open. Put it in the file as unresolved. Anna, born December 9th, 1757. And here's where Peter says the line that has followed him for 260 years. God knows where my wife gets her pregnancies. I do not know if this child is mine. He said it out loud, at court, about his own daughter. Anna lived 15 months. She died on March 8th, 1759. And Catherine, who wrote thousands upon thousands of pages about her own life, essentially never mentions her again. Her memoirs pass over the death of her daughter almost without a word. I've seen that silence read to ways, the cruel reading. The child was politically useless, so she was forgotten. The other reading, the one I lean toward, though I want to be honest that I'm inferring, is that this is what grief looks like in a woman who has learned that any crack in the surface will be used against her. She could not afford to be seen bleeding, so she wrote nothing, and centuries later, we mistook the silence for indifference. Then the third child, April, 1762. By then Peter had been on the throne for 3 months, and Catherine was heavily pregnant by Gregory Orlov, not by her husband. This is the one pregnancy nobody disputes, and she carried it through the winter under heavy court dress, in the same palace as her husband, who was openly talking about divorcing her and marrying his mistress, Elizaveta Vorontsova. The birth had to be invisible, and the story that comes down to us, from Catherine's loyal valet Vasily Shkurin, is that Shkurin solved the problem by burning down his own house, because Peter, who loved a spectacle, could be relied on to go watch a fire. The court emptied out toward the flames. Catherine gave birth in the quiet. One want a flag that won honestly. The fire story is a court anecdote, not an archival document, and it has the too perfect shape of a good story. But the boy is real. He was named Alexei and given the surname Bobrinsky. After the estate that supported him, he was raised away from her. And Catherine's letters about him have the awkward, careful warmth of a woman writing to a child. She is not allowed to love in public. So here's the door. Peter was going to divorce her. He said so, loudly, to anyone who'd listen. He wanted Vorontsova. He wanted Catherine gone. Convent, exile, arrest. It didn't much matter which, and he never did it. For 6 full months he broadcast his intentions and did nothing to execute them. That's the door, and it's the one that mattered most. And he left it standing wide open. 6 months is an enormous amount of time to give a person like Catherine. She used every day of it. Empress Elizabeth died on Christmas Day, 1761, and Peter became emperor of all the Russias. He then proceeded to lose the country in 186 days. That's not a figure of speech. It's roughly the length of his entire reign. He pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War at the exact moment the Russian army was winning it. They had occupied Berlin, and he did it because he idolized Frederick the Great personally. Russian officers who had spent years and thousands of lives grinding Prussia down watched their emperor hand it all back as a gift to his hero. He then announced a war against Denmark for Holstein, which is to say for his personal family territory. Using Russian soldiers, he mocked the Orthodox liturgy in front of clergy. He began moving against church lands. He put his guards in Prussian-style uniforms. I'll say this plainly. I don't think Catherine overthrew Peter. I think Peter demolished himself, and Catherine was the only person standing nearby with a plan. On July 8th, 1762, that plan nearly died. One of her co-conspirators, an officer named Pasek, was arrested. Catherine was at Peterhof. Alexei Orlov rode through the night to reach her, and what happened next was not a masterstroke of strategy. It was improvisation at full speed by a woman who understood she had about 12 hours before someone talked. Before dawn on July 9th, she went to the barracks of the Izmailovsky Guards, not in armor, not on a war horse, whatever the paintings say. She went as a frightened wife. She stood in front of soldiers and asked them to protect her and her son from a husband who meant them harm. The regiment knelt. She went to the Semyonovsky, same result. She went to the Kazan Cathedral, where the clergy were already waiting, and she was proclaimed sole autocrat, not regent for her son. Note, sole, by the time the sun was properly up. 14,000 troops were behind her. She rode out toward Peterhof, a borrowed Preobrazhensky officer's uniform, with a sword she had to borrow too, and her hair down. Now, the what if. And this one is real, not decorative. Peter had options that morning. He had roughly 80,000 men in Pomerania. He had the fortress of Kronstadt. He had a fleet. He had the Holstein Guard at Oranienbaum. Field Marshal Munich, an old campaigner, begged him to sail for the army in Prussia and come back at the head of it. If he had done that, this becomes a civil war, and Catherine, with 14,000 guardsmen and a claim made of nothing but nerve, plausibly loses. Instead, Peter sailed to Kronstadt, was told from the walls that there was no emperor anymore, and turned the boat around. Then he wrote to his wife offering to share power. Then he wrote asking to be allowed to retire to Holstein with his mistress, his dog, and his violin. Then, on July 9th, he signed an abdication. Frederick the Great, his hero, delivered the verdict that has stuck to him ever since. He allowed himself to be dethroned like a child, being sent to bed. 8 days later, he was dead. This is the case that has never closed. And I'm not going to close it for you. I'm going to show you both files. Peter was taken to Ropsha, a country estate about 20 miles from St. Petersburg, and held under guard by a detachment that included Alexei Orlov, Gregory's brother, a huge, violent, effective man. Catherine's stated plan was to move him on to the fortress of Schlüsselburg. On July 17, 1762, Peter died there. He was 34. The official announcement said hemorrhoidal colic, aggravated by an apoplectic stroke, which sounds absurd today, and sounded fairly absurd then. The autopsy reported apoplexy. Some accounts describe discoloration of the body, consistent with strangulation. Others note that discoloration is also consistent with the stated cause and with July heat. The case for murder. There is a letter. It is the single most famous document in this story. A note supposedly written by Alexei Orlov to Catherine. Drunk, panicked, barely coherent. Matushka, little mother. We know not how it happened. He quarreled at table. We tried to separate them, and he was no more. If that letter is real, it is a confession, and it is a confession that begs for a pardon, which implies she had not ordered it, but also that she covered it. The motive is obvious. A living deposed emperor is a permanent invitation to every ambitious officer in Russia. She had already seen what a spare claimant does to a throne. The case against, and this is the part most videos skip. The letter's original does not exist. What we have is a copy said to have been made by Count Fyodor Rostopchin, and the original was supposedly destroyed by Paul I decades later, when he went hunting through his mother's papers. So the central piece of evidence in the most famous murder case in Russian history is a copy of a document nobody living has seen. Historians have argued over its authenticity for 150 years and have not settled it. And consider the motive in reverse. Catherine's position 8 days into her reign was fragile in a way that's hard to overstate. She was a foreigner with no blood claim whatsoever. A murdered emperor was the worst possible thing for her. It handed every enemy she had a permanent weapon, and it did. Within a decade, men would be raising armies in Peter's name. Robert Massey and Simon Dixon both land, cautiously, in the same place. She probably didn't order it, and she certainly benefited, and she punished nobody. Alexei Orlov was never charged. He was rewarded, where I come down, in my view. She didn't order it, and she is responsible for it and not in conflict. Here's what I think happened. She put a deposed emperor in a country house, in the custody of the most violent partisans of her own faction, with no clear instructions and no supervision, and she did nothing to make his survival anyone's job. When you arrange a situation in which a man's death is the convenient outcome for every armed person in the room, you don't need to give an order. You've already given the answer. That's not a verdict. Treat it as mine and weigh it against the file. Because 2 years later, there was a second body, and that one had a paper trail. His name was Ivan, and he had been Emperor of Russia at the age of 2 months. Ivan VI was proclaimed in 1740, deposed by Elizabeth in 1741 before his first birthday, and then buried alive in the penal system for the next 23 years. He was moved from prison to prison, kept from his family, kept from books, kept from anyone who might tell him who he was. Guards were forbidden to use his name. By his 20s he was, by most reports, mentally shattered, though he seems to have known, in some broken way, that he was of imperial blood. He was held at Schlüsselburg, on an island in the Neva, and his 2 permanent guards carried a standing order, in writing, "If anyone attempts to free the prisoner, kill him." That order did not originate with Catherine. Elizabeth issued one. Peter III renewed it. Catherine renewed it again. On the night of July 5, 1764, a young officer of the garrison, Vasily Mirovich, decided to make himself a kingmaker. He rallied a handful of soldiers, turned a cannon on the inner fortress, and demanded the prisoner. The guards did exactly what the paper told them to do. By the time Mirovich forced his way into the cell, Ivan was already dead. He was 23 years old. Mirovich surrendered immediately. He was tried, refused to name any accomplice, and was beheaded in St. Petersburg on September 15, 1764. Notably, Catherine declined a proposal to torture him 4 names, which some read as mercy and others read as a woman who did not want to know what he'd say. Now the door, and it's the coldest one in this entire story. It is a door that was locked in advance, not a decision made in a moment of crisis, but a decision made years earlier, written down, and handed to 2 men with instructions to open it only in the event that someone tried to save a life. If those guards had hesitated for 60 seconds, if Mirovich had come through a different gate, Russia has 2 emperors alive on the same island by morning, and Catherine's throne is genuinely in play. They did not hesitate. And I'll say what I think of everything in the ledger. Ropsha, the partitions, the serfs. This is the entry that's hardest to argue away. Peter III is at least an open case. Ivan is not. Ivan is a signature. And then, having done that, the same woman did something I find almost impossible to reconcile with it. In 1768, smallpox was killing an estimated 400,000 Europeans a year, and it had just killed the fiancée of the Emperor Joseph II, and it had left the Russian court terrified. Catherine had watched it disfigure people she knew. She was 39. The available protection was not vaccination. Genus cowpox breakthrough was still 30 years away. It was variolation, deliberately infecting a healthy person with material from a mild case of actual smallpox, and hoping the resulting illness stayed mild. It usually did. Usually. The death rate ran somewhere around 1 in a few hundred, which sounds small until the person is you, and until you consider that if the Empress dies of a deliberate infection, the man who gave it to her will be torn apart. Catherine sent to England for a physician named Thomas Dimsdale, and then she did the thing that, for me, redeems more of her than any battle she ever won. She did not test it on a serf. She did not test it on a soldier. She had herself inoculated first, in secret, in October 1768, and, knowing exactly what would happen to Dimsdale if it went wrong, she arranged a relay of post-horses to stand ready to get him out of Russia alive. Then she went to a country estate to be ill in private. It worked. She recovered. Her 14-year-old son Paul was inoculated next, and then she made it public, and made it fashionable, which in an autocracy is a technology all its own. Within weeks, courtiers were lining up to get infected on purpose, because the Empress had. Dimsdale was made a baron and given a pension. Inoculation spread through the Russian nobility, and then outward. Contemporary claims about the eventual totals run into the tens of thousands within a few years, and by some accounts, into the millions across her reign, and I'd hold those biggest numbers loosely, because 18th century Russian statistics are estimates dressed as facts, but the core is verified and it is extraordinary. In 1768, the ruler of the largest, least modernized state in Europe understood something that leaders in 2021 were still struggling with. That public health is not an argument you win with a decree. It's an argument you win with your own arm. This is the diary you never read. This is the woman under the harsh joke. And here's what gets me. If you took every fact in this chapter and attached it to a male ruler, that man would be in school books as an Enlightenment hero. Full stop. Instead, this story is a footnote, and the punchline is the headline. Ask yourself why. We'll come back to that. But first, the ghost of Peter III came back, and he came back with an army. In 1773, a Don Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, a deserter, a drifter, a man who had been arrested and escaped more than once, announced to a gathering of Yake Cossacks that he was Peter III. He had not died at Ropsha, he explained. He had escaped. He had wandered Russia in disguise, seeing how his people suffered, and now he had come back for his throne. And for them, it should have been laughable. He looked nothing like Peter. He was illiterate. He could not speak a word of German, which the real Peter spoke better than Russian. It did not matter even slightly, because what Pugachev was offering was not a resemblance. It was a promise. He promised the Cossacks their old liberties. He promised the old believers their old faith. He promised the Bashkirs and the Tatars their land back. And above all, he promised the serfs, who were, at that point, roughly half the population of Russia and legally closer to property than to people, that they were free. His movement swallowed the Volga and the Urals. Estimates of his following run to the tens of thousands, under arms and far more in sympathy. He set up a mock imperial court with officers renamed after Catherine's own generals. He took Kazan in July 1774 and burned much of it. Nobles were hanged in front of their own houses. It was, by a wide margin, the largest popular revolt in Russian history before the 20th century. And here is the door, and it is the biggest what-if in the whole story. Catherine's best armies were not available. They were fighting the Ottoman Empire, hundreds of miles south, for most of a year. The Pugachev rebellion expanded into a vacuum, and Moscow, a city full of serfs, less than 500 miles from the fighting, was watching and, in places, sympathizing. Then, in July 1774, the Ottoman war ended with the Treaty of Coup at Kainaka, and veteran troops came north. Look at the timing. The peace and the fall of Kazan happened the same month. Weeks, in either direction. And this is a different story. If the Turkish war had run one more campaigning season, if Kazan had been the springboard toward Moscow instead of the high water mark, a Cossack pretending to be a dead emperor could plausibly have taken the old capital, not won the empire, probably, but cracked it. It didn't happen. Pugachev was beaten back, and then, on September 14th, 1774, his own Cossacks bound him and handed him over to save themselves. Alexander Suvorov had him put in a metal cage and hauled to Moscow, an animal on tour, so that the countryside could see that the resurrection had ended. He was executed at Bolotnaya Square in Moscow on January 10th, 1775, the 21st, on our calendar. The sentence was to be quartered alive and then beheaded. The executioner beheaded him first. There's long been a story that Catherine quietly ordered the order reversed as a mercy. Contemporaries also whispered that the executioner simply botched it. I'd file that one as unresolved, but the reversal itself is well attested. And now the part that actually matters, and that almost nobody talks about. Catherine won. And then she lost anyway, because the woman who came out of 1775 was not the woman who went in. She had spent a decade corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot. She had written the Nocos, her great instruction to a legislative commission, in which she quoted Montesquieu and Beccaria, argued against torture and against the death penalty, and mused about the moral problem of serfdom. She had, at least on paper, meant some of it, after Pugachev. That door closed, and it stayed closed. She wiped the name of the Yaik River off the map and renamed it the Ural, to erase the memory. She reorganized provincial governments to put more armed authority closer to the ground, and she bound the serfs tighter than she had found them, extending serfdom into Ukraine, handing hundreds of thousands of state peasants to favorites as gifts. Here's what I think, and it's the harshest judgment in this script. The tragedy of Catherine the Great is not that she was a hypocrite, it's that she was sincere, and then she got frightened, and fear made her the most effective enemy her own ideals ever had. The most enlightened monarch in Europe left Russian serfdom stronger than she found it, and that is a straight line running from 1775 to 1861 to 1917. She could not free them, so she conquered instead. In 1755, a young Polish nobleman arrived in St. Petersburg with the British embassy. His name was Stanisław Poniatowski. He was elegant, cultured, and by every account genuinely in love with the unhappy Grand Duchess he met there. He is almost certainly the father of Anna, the daughter who lived 15 months. In 1764, 2 years into her reign, Catherine made him King of Poland. It was not a love letter. It was an installation. Poland's monarchy was elective. Its parliament was paralyzed by the Liberum veto. One deputy could kill any bill. And Catherine wanted the whole country run as a client state. A grateful ex-lover on the throne was the cheapest possible garrison. What she seems not to have priced in was that Poniatowski meant it. He turned out to be a reformer. He built schools, patronized the arts, and pushed to fix the constitutional machinery that made Poland ungovernable. And on May 3, 1791, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth adopted a written constitution, abolishing the Liberum veto, creating a hereditary monarchy and a functioning executive. It is generally recognized as the first codified national constitution in Europe, and the second in the world after the United States. It lasted about 14 months. Catherine sent the army. The second partition followed in 1793. Tadeusz Kościuszko, the same Kościuszko who had built the fortifications at West Point for the Americans, led a rising in 1794, and it was crushed. In 1795, Russia, Prussia, and Austria carried out the third partition, and Poland ceased to exist as a state. Poniatowski abdicated on November 25, 1795. He died in St. Petersburg 3 years later, a pensioner in the capital of the woman who had made him and unmade his country. The door here is a hinge of European history, and I don't think that's an overstatement. Imagine the May 3rd Constitution survives. A reformed, functioning Polish state sits between Russia and the German powers through the 19th century. Every partition-driven catastrophe that follows, the risings, the Russification, the whole geopolitical wound that runs through 1939, runs differently, or doesn't run at all. One woman, one decision, and 123 years of a nation's absence from the map. The way I see it, this is the real indictment, and it is much more serious than anything that happened in a bedroom. The Enlightenment correspondent of Voltaire looked at the first constitution in Europe and read it as an infection to be contained. And the strangest part, she was about to lose control of her own succession in almost exactly the same way. Catherine's relationship with her son Paul is the wound that never healed, and it was inflicted on day one, when Empress Elizabeth carried the newborn out of the room. They were strangers who were required to be mother and son. He grew up in a separate court, surrounded by people who told him, correctly, that his father had died in suspicious circumstances 8 days after his mother took the crown. She never gave him a share of government, which was not unusual for the era, but was pointed in his case. She gave commands and provinces to lovers, and nothing to her heir. Then, in 1777, Paul had a son of his own, Alexander, and Catherine did to Paul exactly what had been done to her. She took the baby. She raised him herself, personally designed his education, wrote children's stories for him, and made no secret of the fact that she considered him the future. It is widely believed she drafted a manifesto disinheriting Paul in Alexander's favor. And here's the thing, nobody has ever produced it. It may have been drafted and not signed. It may have been signed and destroyed by Paul in the first hours after her death. It may have been a rumor that hardened into fact. This is an open case, and it should be presented as one. But her health was running out. And there's a moment I keep circling. September 11th, 1796. Catherine had arranged a brilliant match, her 13-year-old granddaughter Alexandra, to the young King Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden. The betrothal ceremony was set for the throne room of the Winter Palace. The court assembled. Alexandra was dressed. Catherine waited. The problem was one clause. Alexandra was to be permitted to keep her Orthodox faith as Queen of Sweden. Gustav had agreed to it on September 2nd. On the morning of the ceremony, the Russians discovered the clause had been struck from the contract by the king's order. Gustav locked himself in his room and refused to come out. He would not have an Orthodox queen. Catherine stood in that room, in front of her entire court, for more than 4 hours. The bridegroom never came, and by several accounts, the Empress suffered a small stroke that evening, an attack of apoplexy, in the language of the time. 9 weeks later, on November 16th, she collapsed in her dressing room. Her attendants could not lift her. They laid a mattress on the floor. She never regained consciousness and died the following evening, November 17th, 1796, at 67. The door, if the manifesto existed and had been signed and published in, say, October, Paul never reigns, and Paul's reign lasted 4 years and ended in a bedroom in the Mikhailovsky castle on the night of March 23, 1801, when a group of officers strangled him, and his son Alexander, the boy she had raised, took the throne knowing what had been done and having said nothing to stop it. Alexander carried that for the rest of his life. She got the successor she wanted. She just got him through the exact door she'd spent her life trying to seal. Now let's open the file on the myths, because this is where the real crime is. The horse. It is false. Every serious historian and every fact-checking organization that has examined it says the same thing. There is no contemporary source, no autopsy finding, no witness. She died of a stroke, and the autopsy recorded apoplexy, which, if you appreciate irony, is precisely the cause that was announced for Peter III. The story does not appear in her lifetime. It grows in the 19th century, in French and Russian anti-Catherine writing, and it acquires the crushing harness detail purely as narrative garnish. The chamber pot, a related and much older rumor claims she died straining on a toilet. This is closer to something she did apparently collapse in or near her water closet, but the version where a commode collapses under her is embellishment, the erotic cabinet. Now this one's interesting, because it's the one that keeps getting recycled with photographs attached. The claim, a hidden room at Gatchina or another palace, filled with furniture carved with explicit imagery, discovered by German soldiers during the Second World War, who photographed it before the room was lost. Here's the forensic problem. The photographs that circulate are of uncertain provenance and have never been authenticated to a Russian palace. Several versions of the legend date the discovery to 1940, a year before Germany invaded the Soviet Union. There is no inventory, no acquisition record, no pre-war reference. Catherine did collect art, some of it sensual. An 18th century European. Aristocrats absolutely did commission erotica. That part is entirely plausible, but plausible is not documented. Historians treat the cabinet as unverified, and I think the honest verdict is possible in principle, unproven in fact, and almost certainly not in the form the internet shows you, the foot ticklers. You'll find this in a lot of popular history. Full-time servants who tickled the imperial feet while singing bawdy songs. I have not found a solid primary source for it, and I'd flag it as folklore rather than fact. The Potemkin villages, fake facades of prosperous settlements, allegedly erected by Gregory Potemkin along the Dnieper to fool Catherine during her Crimean tour of 1787. Modern historians regard this as, at best, exaggeration, and quite possibly a malicious rumor spread by Potemkin's political enemies. It has become an English idiom on the strength of a smear. So what's actually true? She had lovers, roughly a dozen are documented. Some counts run higher. She was serially, openly attached to men, most of them much younger toward the end, and she did promote them, Potemkin above all, who was not just a favorite, but arguably the most capable administrator of her reign, and quite possibly her secret husband. She pensioned them off generously when it ended. Potemkin, after their romance court, remained her closest partner in government for the rest of his life, and by many accounts helped vet the men who came after him. A dozen lovers over 34 years. In a century when Augustus the Strong of Saxony was credited with hundreds of children and nobody built a legend around it. So here's what I think the whole story actually is. It isn't gossip, it's a demotion. Consider what she was, on the record. She took a country the rest of Europe treated as a frozen backwater and made it a first-rank power. She annexed the Crimea, took enormous territory from the Ottomans, founded cities, and expanded the empire by something on the order of 200,000 square miles. She founded the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded institution for the education of women in Europe. She built the Hermitage collection, which is now one of the great museums on earth. She rebuilt Russian provincial administration. She ran the first mass inoculation campaign in the empire and used her own body as the proof. Now, how do you write that woman out of the room? You can't argue with the results, so you change the subject. You make the story about her body instead of her decisions, and this is not a theory. It's what her contemporaries did in real time. Charles Masson's secret memoirs of the Court of St. Petersburg, published in 1800, 4 years after her death, is a foundational text of the smut, written by a man with grievances. The French pamphlet trade did the rest, and it worked so well that 230 years later, most people who can't name a single thing she built can tell you a joke about a horse. That's the diary you never read, not a hidden document, a public life, deliberately papered over. Count the doors. A 15-year-old nearly dies of fever and asks for the right priest. A husband announces for 6 months that he'll divorce her, and never does it. An emperor with 80,000 men and a fleet gives up in a day because a fortress wouldn't open a gate. A deposed man is left in a country house with the wrong guards and dies conveniently, and nobody is punished. A written order sits in a guard's pocket 4 years, waiting for someone to try to save a life. A physician from England is smuggled in, and an empress rolls up her own sleeve first. A peace treaty is signed with the Ottomans in the exact month a rebel takes Kazan. A constitution is written in Warsaw, and an army is sent to erase it. A Swedish king locks himself in a room over one clause, and an old woman stands in a throne room for 4 hours in front of her entire court. Not one of those is destiny. Every single one is a person, in a room, deciding. And here's what I keep landing on, and it's the thing I want you to take away from this. We tell the story of Catherine the Great as if she were a force of nature, the insatiable empress, the appetite in a crown. It's a comfortable story, because forces of nature aren't responsible for anything. But she wasn't a force of nature. She was a nearsighted, hard-working German woman who scheduled her days in 5-minute blocks, got up at 5 in the morning her whole adult life, -1, when she got older, lit her own fire, made her own coffee, and worked. She was funny in her letters. She was vain about her legs. She wrote plays that weren't very good and knew it. She was, in the modern sense, a workaholic, and she was terrified, reasonably, given how she'd taken power, of being taken the same way. And that fear is the tragedy, because in my view, the great near miss of Catherine's life isn't a throne she almost lost. It's a country she almost changed, for about 10 years, roughly 1762 to 1772. There was a genuine possibility that the Russian Empire would begin dismantling serfdom from the top, under a ruler who had read the arguments, written them down herself, and had the absolute power to act. That door was open, Pugachev slammed it, and she bolted it from the inside. And the consequences of that bolted door killed more people over the next 140 years than every war she ever fought. That's what I think we should be arguing about, not the furniture. 2 images to leave you with. The first is her funeral, which she planned herself. In a testament written years before her death, she asked to be dressed in white with a gold crown, her Christian name inscribed on it. And this is the line that gets me. She asked that court mourning be worn for 6 months, and the shorter the better. Even her own grief she wanted efficient. Her court overruled her, of course. They put her in silver brocade and gold, and laid her out in state. And 4 weeks the people of St. Petersburg filed past and kissed the hand of a woman who was no longer there. And then Paul did the thing that tells you everything about what she'd built and what it cost. He had his father's body exhumed from the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, where it had lain for 34 years without a coronation. He had the coffin opened. He had the crown placed on it. And then he made the old men of his mother's coup, including Alexei Orlov, the man from Ropsha, walk in the funeral procession, carrying the imperial regalia of the emperor they had helped destroy. Peter III and Catherine II were buried side by side in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, in the same ceremony, as if the 34 years in between had never happened. She spent her life making sure that man could never take anything from her, and in the end her own son put her back in the ground next to him. But the last word should be hers, because sometime around 1778, in French, in her own hand, Catherine wrote her own epitaph, not the propaganda version, the one she wanted on the stone. Here lies Catherine II. She forgave easily and hated no one, tolerant, undemanding, of a gay disposition. She had a republican spirit and a kind heart. She had friends. Work was easy to her. She loved the arts and to be sociable. Read that against everything you've just heard. The blood at Ropsha, the order at Schlüsselburg, the army sent to Warsaw, the serfs, that gap between the woman she believed she was and the empire she actually built is, I think, the real story of Catherine the Great, not a scandal, a self-portrait that doesn't match the photograph, and she deserves to be argued with on those terms. She earned that much. She did not earn the horse. If this changed how you see her, tell me in the comments, especially on Ropsha. Do you think she gave the order? Or do you think she just built the room where it happened? I've told you where I land. I'd like to hear where you do. Hit like and subscribe, because we do this every week. The moment history almost went the other way. And if you want another empire that turned on one decision nobody thought was important at the time, that video is on your screen right now.